y'all, it's Kim. So y'all know that I'm going through the Senate torture report, that big long name report, this thing right here, report of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Committee study of the Central Intelligence Agency's detention and interrogation program, together with forward by Chairman Feinstein, whatever, Diane, she passed away, and additional minority views, December 9th, 2014. Anyway, something that popped up in there was basically like the Geneva Conventions, and then I think the UN. I'll have to look it back up. All of my stuff, for whatever reason, my tabs deleted earlier. I think I clicked the wrong button. But anyway, the Geneva Conventions of 12th of August 1949. I think this is the international, what is it called? This RC here. It'll probably pop up here in a second. Yeah, International Committee of the Red Cross, because the ICRC was overseeing some of the stuff in this Senate Select Committee report. But anyway, so this is basically about torture and stuff like that, how you're supposed to treat prisoners, things like that. Let's keep going. So here's all the content. I will just put this in, the description, the link in the description, like I normally do. And then we'll keep going. Yeah, we'll keep on going. That seems like a repeat of the same thing. Let's go. Come on, get to the parts. Yeah, hold on. Yep. Okay, let's see. Hopefully we're getting somewhere. This is like a lot. Well, where's it at? Okay, the Geneva Conventions of 12th of August 1949. Preliminary remarks. The International Committee of the Red Cross has, from the outset, been the sponsor of the Geneva Convention for the protection of wounded military personnel and of the humanitarian conventions which supplement it. Each of these fundamental international agreements is inspired by respect for human personality and dignity. Together, they establish the principle of disinterested aid to all victims of war without discrimination, to all those who, whether through wounds, capture, or shipwreck, are no longer enemies, but merely suffering and defenseless human beings. Throughout the years, the International Committee for labored unremittingly, or has labored unremittingly, for the greater protection in international law of the individual against the hardships of war. It successively elaborated the humanitarian conventions and adapted them to current needs or instituted new ones. In the period between the two world wars, the committee's main achievement lay in the establishment of a number of draft conventions, chief among which was a convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. This was signed in the summer of 1929 and during the last conflict protected millions of captives. Other new or revised draft conventions were to have been submitted to a diplomatic conference, which the Swiss Federal Council planned to convene early in 1940. Hostilities unfortunately intervened. The year 1945 marked the close of a war waged on an unprecedented scale. The task had to be faced of developing and adapting the humanitarian elements of international law in the light of the experience gained. The International Committee's proposals met with the early approval of governments and national Red Cross societies and immediately set to work. Three former conventions had to be revised. The Geneva Convention of 1929 for the relief of the wounded and sick in armies in the field. I guess it would be like the 10th Hague Convention of 1907 for the adaptation to maritime warfare of the principles of the Geneva Convention, and the 1929 Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. Furthermore, there was urgent need for a convention for the protection of civilians, the absence of which had during the world conflict led to such grievous consequences. The International Committee worked on the lines it had followed after the 1914 to 1918 war. First, it collected the fullest possible preliminary information on those aspects of international law that required confirmation, enlargement, or amendment. Then, with the help of experts from various countries, it prepared the revised and new drafts, which were submitted first to an international Red Cross conference and then to a diplomatic conference empowered to give these treaties final validity. The first meeting of experts was held in October 1945 and comprised the neutral members of the mixed medical commissions, which during the conflict had visited wounded or sick prisoners of war to decide about their repatriation. The second meeting was the preliminary conference of National Red Cross Societies for the study of the conventions and of various problems relative to the Red Cross, which the International Committee convened at Geneva in July and August 1946, and before which the first drafts were laid. Having gathered the suggestions of Red Cross agencies on points which were within their particular fields, the committee made a close study during the months that followed and collected very full data on all matters dealt with in the proposed conventions. Consultations included one in March 1947 with representatives of the religious and secular bodies, which had collaborated with the committee in giving spiritual and intellectual aid to victims of the war. From April 14th to 26th, 1947, the Conference of Government Experts for the Study of Conventions for the Protection of War Victims was held in Geneva. This was attended by 70 representatives of 15 governments, which had held large numbers of prisoners and civilian internees during the war, and were therefore particularly experienced in the matters under discussion. Combining the committee's proposals, the suggestions made by the Red Cross societies, and drafts prepared by several governments, the conference agreed to the new text proposed and to the first draft of a convention for the protection of civilian persons in time of war. The International Committee also sought the advice of several governments which were not represented by the at the April conference. Some sent experts to Geneva in June 1947. The drafts in preparation were also submitted by the committee to a special commission of National Red Cross societies, which met at Geneva in September of the same year. After careful editing early in the year, the draft conventions were sent by the committee in May 1938 to all governments and National Red Cross societies in preparation for the 17th, I think, 17th International Red Cross Convention. I had to remember my Roman numerals, y'all. This conference was in Stockholm from August 20th to the 31st of 1948. The representatives of 50 governments and 52 National Red Cross societies were present. With some amendments, the drafts were adapted or adopted. After passing through the many preparatory stages briefly described, these texts were eventually taken as the sole working documents of the Diplomatic Conference of Geneva. Out of these grew the 1949 Geneva Conventions. The Diplomatic Conference for the Establishment of International Conventions for the Protection of Victims of War, convened by the Swiss Federal Council as trustee of the Geneva Conventions, was held in Geneva from April 21st to August 12th, 1949. Of the 63 governments represented at the conference, 59 had sent plenipotentiaries, I think that's what it says. 4 sent observers only. Representatives of the International Committee were invited to participate in the capacity of experts. After 4 months of continuous debate, The conference established the following four conventions, which are given below. Geneva Convention for the amelioration, I think that's how you say it, of the condition of the wounded and sick in armed forces in the field of August 12th, 1949. Geneva Convention for the amelioration, I think that's how you're saying it, of the condition of wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea of August 12th, 1949. Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war of August 12th, 1949. Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war of August 12th, 1949. The conference at once divided into four committees, the first for the revision of Conventions 1 and 2, the second for the revision of Convention 3, the prisoners of war, the third to establish a new convention relative to the protection of civilian persons, and lastly, the Joint Committee to deal with provisions common to the four conventions. Coordination and drafting committees met towards the end of the conference to harmonize the four texts. When necessary, the committees formed working parties. At the closing meeting, delegations of the following states signaled the final act: Afghanistan, Albania, Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Bulgaria, Burma, Canada, Chile, China, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Ecuador, Egypt, Ethiopia, Finland, France, Greece, Guatemala, the Holy See. What is that? I've never heard that. Okay, Hungary, India, Iran, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Yugoslavia, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Liechtenstein. Sorry, I couldn't do it. Okay, they're all stands, but anyway, Luxembourg, Mexico, Monaco, Netherlands, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, Pakistan, Peru, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Siam, Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarus, Soviet Socialist of Republic of Ukraine, Spain, Sweden, Syria, Turkey, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Okay, and then United Kingdom, United States of America, Uruguay, and Switzerland. 17 delegations also signed the four conventions. 44 other states had signed when the agreed 6 months period expired on February 12th, 1950. According to their provisions, the new Geneva Conventions come into force 6 months after the deposit of at least two instruments of ratification. Thereafter, they come into force for each contracting party 6 months after it ratifies. When they sign, everybody signs. So provisions common to the four conventions. The Geneva Diplomatic Conference made an innovation in grouping together and amplifying the common provisions, up to then dispersed and rudimentary, now practically identical in the four conventions. They may be considered under three headings. General provisions. The general provisions are given in a dozen articles of great importance at the beginning of each convention, laying down the mode of application. They deal with respect for the convention and their application in international conflict, enemy occupation, or civil war. They are followed by provisions about the duration of application. Special agreements with contracting parties may include the inalienability of the right of protected persons, the duties of protected powers, or their substitutes, the activities of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and conciliation procedure between the contracting parties. Repression of breaches of the conventions. Article 49 to 52 of the first convention, 50 to 53 of the second, 129 to 131 of the third, and 146 to 149 of the fourth. The Stockholm Conference had expressed the view that the provisions it had approved were still inadequate and had requested the International Committee to continue its study of this important question. After consulting lawyers of international repute, the committee prepared suggestions which appeared in the volume Remarks and Proposals submitted for consideration. The conference used these suggestions as a basis for its deliberations. The first of the articles imposes penal sections for breaches of the convention, in particular for grave breaches as defined in the succeeding article. These texts will doubtless be an important contribution toward defining war crimes in international law. The term is frequently used and seen in print, but still awaits an acceptable legal definition. Let's see. Final provisions. We'll just read maybe this first Geneva Convention thing. Anyway, final provisions. The final provisions appear at the end of each convention and define the procedure for the signature, ratification, and entry into force of the conventions and for accession to them. Excuse me, good grief. Okay, first Geneva Convention, the wounded and sick. The traditional Geneva Convention, brought into being by the newly created International Committee of the Red Cross in 1864, is the source of the Geneva Conventions, which are now universally accepted. The original convention gave the impetus to the Red Cross movement throughout the world. It likewise inspired the impulsion in international law towards an increasing regulation and eventually the restriction and final prohibition of war itself. This first international treaty, the fundamental principles of which have remained unshaken, was nevertheless marked by omissions and imperfections, and as early as 4 years after signature, a conference was convened to discuss its revision. On October 20th, 1868, the conference proposed a number of additional articles, providing in particular for the extension of the convention to maritime warfare, but they were never ratified. A recommendation by the First Hague Conference in 1899 raised the question of revision again. The 1906 Diplomatic Conference established a revised text which recasts and considerably developed the 1864 text. After the First World War, it was clear that the Geneva Conventions needed adapting to the conditions of modern warfare. During the 1929 Diplomatic Conference at Geneva, the text was once more revised, although to a lesser extent than on the first occasion. In 1937, after renewed discussion by a commission of international experts called by the International Committee, another revised text was established. The draft, after submission to the 16th International Red Cross Conference, London in 1938, was placed on the agenda of the diplomatic conference planned for 1940, but postponed by the Second say that 3 times fast, Second World War. We have shown how the 1937 draft was shaped by the experience of the 6 momentous war years. The help of the National Red Cross Society is closely involved historically in the application and development of the convention was particularly valuable. The text of the first convention, as revised by the 1949 conference, follows traditional lines and the fundamental principles that govern former versions, wounded or sick, and therefore defenseless combatants shall be respected and cared for, whatever their nationality, personnel attending them, the buildings in which they shelter, and the equipment used for their benefit shall be protected. A Red Cross on a white ground shall be the emblem of this immunity. As will be seen later, the greatest divergence arises from the very conditions of modern warfare, which made it necessary to restrict the privileges of medical personnel and equipment in enemy hands. On the other hand, almost all articles have been made more precise. The general provisions are followed by Chapter 2, dealing with the wounded and sick. Article 13, drawn from the 1929 Prisoners of War Convention, enumerates the categories of persons put on the same footing as members of the armed forces and hence entitled to protection under the convention. Whereas a 1949 text demanded respect and protection only for the wounded, Article 12, which is new, gives a list of prohibited acts, attempts upon life, torture, willful abandonment, and so on. The information to be given about wounded captives and the duties to the dead have been defined in Articles 16 and 17. A new provision, Article 18, guarantees to the inhabitants and to relief societies the right of assisting the wounded and sick. Chapter 3, medical units and establishments, has not undergone alteration except for the introduction of Article 23, creation of safety zones and localities. Chapter 4, medical personnel and chaplains have been greatly modified. Hitherto, such such personnel falling into enemy hands had to be immediately repatriated. The 1949 convention provides that they may, in certain circumstances, be retained to care for prisoners of war, their special status, and the conditions of their repatriation of those not required. Article 30 to 32 have been carefully defined. Article 28 thus filling a serious gap. Chapter 5, medical equipment has been substantially altered to take changes regarding personnel into account. Equipment need no longer be handed back to the belligerent to whom it belongs. In Chapter 6, similar provision is made for transport vehicles, Article 35. It should be noted that medical aircraft are now authorized in certain circumstances to fly over neutral countries. Chapter 7, distinctive emblem, marks no change in principle. Nevertheless, Article 44, the wording of which left so much to be desired in the 1929 text, is now stated in logical and balanced terms, while the protective emblem is subject to strict safeguards. The purely indicatory I can't even say the word indicatory emblem may be widely used by Red Cross societies. In Chapter 8, application of the conventions calls for no comments. So, reference has already been made to Chapter 9, repression of abuses and infractions, and to the final provisions, Article 53, which is peculiar to the first convention, is intended to prevent abuse of the distinctive emblem. All right, I'm going to stop it here. So, Second Geneva Convention is where we'll pick back up. But I will talk to y'all later. Y'all have a great afternoon. See y'all. Bye.